this was not the video I initially planned to make. See, I actually planned to make a video about the Custodes change basically within the first week. But I am very poor at this whole work-life balance thing where I spend too much of my time and energy doing a day job and not enough time and energy working on anything else, to include scripting videos or editing videos, to the point where I had to do a new version of this video because Games Workshop did a price increase and I had to change how I was addressing certain things because we're seeing different patterns from the company than we were a couple years ago. Because one of the things I try to do is I try to account for as many variables as possible when discussing certain topics such as how a company is run. So why am I still talking about the Custodes after a month? Well, at the time of recording, we're actually watching some, potentially hilarious fallout from a vocal minority of the community who swears up and down that Games Workshop is ruining everything. So they tried to run off and join Trench Crusade. Found out that Discord server was run by a group that was not inviting to them, got kicked out of there, and are throwing a fit. All because Games Workshop put women into the Custodian Guard. This honestly, watching just the complete clown show that has been that part of the online community around Warhammer has been frankly hilarious, because there's a clear sign that a lot of the most vocal of them don't even understand Warhammer. But really, before we get too deep into all this, I'm going to be discussing things about how Games Workshop is run, and certain things that from an American perspective I can see that they are doing. And I clarify this, not only because clearly my voice tells you that I am not British, but I also cannot spend my time going through the trash at Nottingham to figure out why they do certain things. The best I can do is try to understand from my understanding how businesses work, thanks to a couple of years of, business courses at college, and just a general understanding of where Games Workshop is coming from and where I can best guess they are going, under the assumption that they are a business that likes to make money. Because all businesses, if they are run correctly, like to make money. For example, businesses that apparently do not like to make money, look at Twitter. You can see a clear difference in how companies are run. So, to kind of talk about where we're going, we need to talk about how we got here. And around a month ago now, from the time of the recording of this, we had the NDA on the Custodes Codex lifted on that Saturday, and then we got news that there were women in the Codex. Not the Sisters of Silence that everybody would expect, of course, but female custodians. And one of the ones who's been the most interesting has been, of course, the 2-page story for Kesh, where we find out that, some people play the blood games quietly and sneakily, and some people, like Kesh, go for the most over-the-top answer possible. And, I enjoy it because that flair for the dramatic is an interesting character trait that was fun to kind of think about, and spawned a few memes of basically anything that's going wrong on Terra is apparently now her fault as part of her blood games. Gene Stealers? It must have been Kesh. The Reign of Blood? Probably Kesh. The War of the Beast? It was Kesh. Now, obviously, we don't have any true fluff that backs this up. It's fun to kind of poke fun at things. But this had some unexpected ripples from the community. You see, we got people responding to this who were calling Custodes a kind of space marine, which was unusual because anybody who's been in the community longer than a week can tell just by looking at the models they are not space marines. No, the issue with the Codex wasn't the meager 4 detachments that it got, or that Sisters of Silence did not get any new unit options, or model kits in general, or that Games Workshop's been beating the edition with a Nerf hammer for the most part. No, that whole idea that women could be Custodes was their issue. And this was addressed even further by them claiming that the community account on Twitter was gaslighting everybody. Why? Because apparently none of them know how retcons work. You see, when a company, when someone who runs an IP or writes books or, generally has a creative universe, gives you information that changes how you perceive that universe, it creates what is called retroactive continuity, or a retcon, telling you that some Custodes are women under all that gold armor, does not mean that the models we have right now were sculpted with the intent to be women. It does not mean that we have books where the Custodes are women. What it means is that as far as the setting is concerned, there have always been women there. It doesn't mean that what we have in reality reflects that, because it obviously doesn't. Games Workshop isn't lying to us and saying that women have always existed in the model range, nor are they saying that women Custodes have always been leading books or anything else. So, of course, with gaslighting comes, we also got claims that Amazon was at fault, because there's this persistent belief going back literally decades that Games Workshop's about to go under any possible moment, and that some company like Hasbro or apparently Amazon is going to swoop in and buy them out. To the fact that where people actually believe that Games Workshop is always trying to devalue itself somehow to be bought out. Not only is this ridiculous, because that is not how companies work. A properly run company, especially one that's publicly traded, is always trying to increase its value, which makes it more valuable when it is bought out. And a company like Amazon doesn't have the ability, just by signing a contract saying that they are going to pitch a show, not even a contract that says they are currently making a show, just that they are pitching a show and have rights to work with Games Workshop's IP and with the company to create this pitch, doesn't give them any leverage to control how Games Workshop does anything. Even if they did get a show, they aren't going to have the rights to do so. We were talking about Games Workshop. They are notoriously stingy with how the IP works. They have been very good about keeping companies that were sometimes larger than them, to include publishing companies. Besides, something that people are overlooking or maybe are not aware of is that we have a minimum 6 months between when a book is sent to publish and when it is released. Honestly, after COVID, I would actually probably put it closer to 9 months. This book would have been sent off to publishing before Amazon even approached them about potentially making a show. I'm sorry, anybody who thinks that, we magically have a situation where Amazon is going to, produce a show right now is probably mistaken. Honestly, most of the codexes we're getting right now were probably finished or being finished when the edition launched, at the latest. It's entirely possible Games Workshop had all these codexes done before the edition, which would honestly explain a lot, but we'll have to kind of keep watching that as we go and figure that one out. Now, of course, there is one more claim that has been coming out of the woodwork, and that is that Vanguard or BlackRock, or sometimes who knows who else, investment company-wise, is somehow trying to force DEI practices on Games Workshop. And if you've ever even heard of the word stock market, that should sound pretty stupid to you. Like, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It is just a gross misunderstanding of how stocks work. In short, a stock is a promissory note of sort. A company asks for money in exchange for dividends that will be paid in the future. This is done to give the company a certain amount of capital going into either launching itself, because some companies will, open stock trading early on, or before it starts to expand. And Games Workshop has been on the stock market in England since 1994. 30 years it has been on the stock market. Games Workshop is not being mishandled by external companies. Its biggest shareholders are investment firms that build portfolios. That's right, they are just a stock among a group of stocks that is used because they have a slow but steady rate of growth. Recent years it's been a little bit higher, which has caused the stocks to spike in value before coming back down again. That sort of result is fairly normal coming out of COVID. A lot of companies have had similar results. The thing is that unless a company owns a majority of the shares and stocks, they don't have control of basically anything. Now, they could team up together and try to leverage support, but even if you put BlackRock and Vanguard together, they don't have enough control over the shares to be able to leverage anything. Basically, they get the same rights that any other stockholder does. They get to vote on board members and CEO, and they get paid dividends. And that's about it most of the time. Now, there may be situations where they get votes on things like stock splits or stock mergers or buybacks or, a number of other things, usually involving their rights as stockholders. But when it comes to the day-to-day management of the company, that's not what they're doing. Companies like BlackRock and Vanguard buy stocks based on their performance, but they also buy stocks based on specific other attributes, which is where the diversity, equity, and inclusion ratings that they use come in at. They want companies that meet certain additional metrics on their own before they buy stocks from them. That's it. And they're usually not buying the stocks directly from the companies. They're buying them on the open stock market, which means they're probably buying them from other people who already own those stocks. This is just generally how the stock market works. This isn't a conspiracy, I'm sorry. There isn't some woke rogue agent trying to force down the value of Games Workshop, which of course brings us back to what's all this hubbub overlays. Well, it's the thing that I wish would stop. It's woke spotting. It is an attempt by people who don't like specific changes to tar those changes with a brush, in this case calling it woke or calling it DEI, or forced representation, or who knows what other random nonsense is going to come out of their backside next. Basically, what they want to do is they want to claim ownership over an IP, one that they may not even participate with. Let's be honest here, if you're confusing Custodes for Space Marines, your involvement with Warhammer is not very deep, if any. And that's before we get into the fact that a lot of the accounts that are posting these things are ones who don't talk about the game, they don't talk about the rules of the game, they don't talk about the background setting very much, unless it's to try to browbeat somebody else about how female Space Marines have never existed in the lore, some other thing where they were trying to argue against whatever the change they don't like. No, basically they just don't participate unless it's to try to claim ownership over this thing. Now, it's possible. And, I can't speak for completely 100% of every single person who's screaming about Games Workshop being woke, or Games Woke Shop, or woke shop, or, whatever other thing we're going to go with here. Woke, work, woke. At this point, I'm surprised nobody's having a stroke. But the thing is that almost every account that has been screaming about this does not share models online. They do not participate in the online community in any constructive fashion. Their entire involvement is about trying to claim ownership and to gatekeep. And surprise, we're going to be talking about this again, but Games Workshop doesn't want gatekeepers. I know that's a surprise to some people, but that's not what a company wants. They want people to buy their product, not people standing out front of their business telling people to go away. They don't need bouncers. It's not a bar. Now, of course, I'm sure somebody's going to, reply in the comments below that I'm horribly misgeneralizing an entire community of people. But yeah, it's possible. But honestly, when I continue to deal with them online and I fail to see anything from them other than vitriol and sometimes just straight up bigotry, it's hard to see them as actually participating in the community and seeing more that their hobby is trying to force everyone they don't like out. Because let's be honest here, you can name every single Space Marine in the Horus Heresy from memory, or know how many braids are Shadow Sun's ponytail, or been playing since Rogue Trader launched in 1987, they will still call you a tourist if you think that Games Workshop's games are for everyone. And this isn't the first time this has happened, and I unfortunately don't think it's going to be the last. Though the Trench Crusade thing gives me hope because they've been horribly embarrassed themselves recently, and it's great. And nothing takes the wind out of their sails quite like public embarrassment like that. So when I say it's not the first time, we saw them raise a stink. Now, granted, they weren't as vocal then. This was still before Trump got elected, but or shortly thereafter. I'll be honest here, the exact year it happened eludes me, but when Arch Warhammer, also known as Archcast, or just Arch, had Games Workshop issue him a cease and desist to take the Warhammer out of his name and his brand, and then contacted World of Warships and told them that Arch was blacklisted from working on any Games Workshop related promotions, they got upset. Now, like I said, there weren't as much of a vocal percentage. We had more moderation in social media at the time. We also had them less emboldened to be a whole freaking circus of clowns, to be honest. But we also saw them do the same nonsense in 2020 when Games Workshop published Warhammers for Everyone. Part of what they were trying to do for a couple of years, really, was try to claim that, no, Warhammer is for, and I quote, anyone, end quote. And the reason they would do this is they were trying to play semantics. They wanted to try to redefine it to say that it can't be for everyone. So it has to be for anyone. And if it's for anyone, then they can exclude people because it may not be for you if you have any complaints about it whatsoever. Because, let's be honest here, they don't understand that the true longest running hobby of the community is complaining about things that Games Workshop does. We do it because we care, even when we're annoying about it. But they have chosen this belief that, no, you can't have any requests from Games Workshop at all, because then it's not for you. You want to change things. You want things to be different. You don't respect the lore, except for the fact that it's fluff, not lore. The canon has never existed by their own admission, and that they're basically just creating a false idol that they hold up and claim that is the true Warhammer that doesn't look anything like Warhammer. And we saw the same group of people, only louder this time because, surprise, surprise, it involves a black person or black character. You see, we got a novel that had Captain Felix on it. And it turned out he's black. And it turns out the idea of a black ultramarine horribly offended some of these people, to include Arch, who had a whole video on the idea that, about black space marines being a problem. There were people who legitimately argued, well, I shouldn't say legitimately, because their arguments were not legitimate, but they actually argued the stupidest things, like the idea that only salamanders can be black space marines. They argued that all space marines look like their Primarchs, which definitely isn't true, because if you look at the Horus Heresy, we see it called out very specifically that somebody looks like Horus, to the point they call him Little Horus as a nickname. Or you can just look at pictures of Space Marines. Marneus Calgar does not look like Gilliman. Cato Sagarius does not look like Marneus Calgar or Gilliman. He looks like his own person, Now, it is true, there are aspects about the Primarchs that do show up more often. For example, Emperor's children do tend to have white hair a lot more commonly. The Imperial Fist tend to look like they're bricks in how their faces look. This is normal, it's fine. Part of it is how the gene seed causes the body to express certain things through, magical hormones and whatever. But it's a trend. It's not an exact clone. These are not Primarch clones. They are not exact copies. Not even close. I mean, if they were, the salamanders would have a natural African skin tone and not be described as literally coal black. Kind of a big difference there between the ethnicity and literally the color of coal. Those are not the same things. But we had these stupid arguments, and, obviously it really outed the group, a large part of that group, for what they were. Horrible bigots. I hate to tell you this, but if you're freaking out that a Space Marine can be black just because he's not a salamander, you are not a good person. Your whole life probably needs to be rethought from day one. Go back to start and do not pass go. Do not collect $200. That is not okay. There is something horribly wrong with the way you look at the world. And of course, a year after we had Warhammers for Everyone, we also had them throw a massive fit when Games Workshop responded to a tournament in Spain that involved a player who had gone by the moniker, quote, Austrian painter, unquote, who wore Nazi symbols to include a swastika made of swastikas, And GW said, we don't want Nazis at our events. We don't want you wearing symbols of actual real-life hate groups. We don't want you. We do not want you as customers. We do not want you at our events. We do not want your money. And for some reason, they got really offended at this. For some magical reason that they tell me they're not Nazis, but they get really upset anytime somebody says Nazis can't be involved in something. When somebody's literally wearing Nazi symbols, they get upset when they're told, no, you can't do this. Really doesn't make any sense to them. If you're not a Nazi, you should not be offended when people say we don't want Nazis. If you tell me no Nazis, I'm like, cool, that's great. I love that idea. I don't want to deal with any fucking Nazis either. But they got mad. And they, of course, got mad again with this Custodes change. And it's not ending. They tried to also get mad that a Sisters of Battle novel that came out 2+ years ago has a trans character mentioned. Except for it's not even a main character. The scene in question has a Sister of Battle talking to a ship's captain. The captain mentions that he has a friend who took the same name as the Sister of Battle from a book called the Book of Heroes when that friend transitioned. The Sister of Battle doesn't even bat an eye at the idea of a trans person because, and the author has confirmed this, James Swallow has said the idea that trans people exist would not be a big deal by then. The Sister of Battle was more embarrassed that her name was even in the Book of Heroes because she didn't feel worthy. But they looked at this, and they freaked out the idea that Games Workshop mentioned trans people in the setting. Not that, especially as humans, because, and if they understood anything, they'd probably be upset that we had in the Gazgul novel the fact that orcs do not have male and female genders, they have no gender. Boys is probably as close to a gender as you're going to get. When they are translated into, what we can read as English, which is, most likely Low Gothic in the setting, the pronouns used for Gazgul are they and them. Third-person pronouns. And, if they understood it, they'd probably be upset. But instead, they like to roll out orcs and go, but you want female Custodes, or you want female Space Marines. What about Misters of Battle? Or what about female orcs? Well, we need to have male orcs first. But they don't understand that because they don't read the books. Granted, I can't seem to get anybody to read the Gazgul novel, even with by telling them there's a lesbian inquisitor involved. I don't know why people will not freaking read some things sometimes. I give recommendations based on stuff I've read. It's a good book. It's really enjoyable. You get to learn a lot about Gazgul. I'm sorry he doesn't spend the entire book making kissy faces with Yarrick, if that's what you wanted, but it's still a good story. Now, back on track before I tangent myself into a knot. I have obviously not listed every single bit of manufactured outrage that's come from that vocal part of that is made up of people who want to stir up controversy either as an excuse to try to force people out of the community or for clicks on the internet because they want attention and easy grift money, like Gums. Yeah, Grums is definitely on that latter camp. Same for Arch. Because Arch doesn't do a lot of narrative content anymore. He likes to instead discussing the fluff, hang out with actual open fascists like the Golden One, and the nonce that is Sargon of God. Now, the thing is that these are the people that want to push a narrative that there are invaders who want to weaken the setting in some sort of great nerd replacement conspiracy. Instead of, coming to terms with the fact that their ideas are unpopular and don't make a lot of money. The obvious thing is when you have diversity in humanity and then you reflect it in your setting, it's more appealing to humanity. If I look around and I see more variety in skin tones than I do, in the mayo section at the grocery store, I'm going to assume that my setting should probably look the same. It should have more diversity than a bunch of white dudes. If there's a bunch of gay people in real life, and I'm writing a setting that uses human beings, there should probably be gay people in it. Same for trans people. It's really not a hard thing to understand, And if adding women or black people or gay people or trans people to a setting ruins it for you, the IP really isn't what you were caring about. It was the fact that you had a setting you believed excluded those people. And if excluding people is all you want, you could just write fan fiction to beat off to without needing to buy from a company that charges $60 for 10 models. it's cheaper, and we don't have to deal with you. It's a win-win. But while normal people aren't getting upset by diversity, reflecting the diversity of actual humanity, especially, the diversity in a setting like 40K where humans are so widely spread that gene stealer cults go undetected for ages because being slightly purplish in the skin and bald isn't that unusual, or an actual Astartes can walk around pretending to be human by taking off their armor, wearing a poncho, and walking a little slower, purposely playing up being clumsier and less inhumanly smooth in how they move. If that's all it takes for those guys to pass as human, or the fact that the Custodes have been running around for 10,000 years as the eyes of the Emperor reporting, potential threats back to the Imperial Palace. Basically, the idea that humanity lacks diversity and is nothing but a bunch of milquetoast white dudes is friggin' stupid. So, when we get past the idea that there are fictional invaders and forced diversity, what does that leave us with? Because we don't have anybody outside forcing GW to be woke. They're not, not being forced to include people that don't exist. They're not being forced, There's no outside pressure pushing them to do this. Where's the woke coming from, basically? And the short answer is it's coming from inside the house. And the reason it's coming from the inside the house is because it makes, and I don't mean secret woke cabal money, but from actual customers who want to buy the products that they're selling. Now, I gotta back up a little bit here because we have to talk about the past. You see, I mentioned earlier that GW has been publicly traded since 1994. Well, 2 years before that, Tom Kirby bought out Games Workshop's management. And that was shortly before we got 3rd edition. 3rd edition came out in 1997, I believe. I might be wrong, it might be 98, but the late 90s we got 3rd edition, Warhammer 40K. The edition where the overt political commentary went from very bigly obvious satire with a lot of punk overtones to being a lot more subtle and played straight. A lot more grim and dark. And now, it might not have been Kirby's direct management influence that pushed this change, but it is very interesting that very shortly after they started becoming a publicly traded company on the stock market, that the obvious satire of 2nd edition was scrubbed off and left us with a grimmer, darker 40K played more straight. Just kind of something that feels very normal for a company to do when it's trying to become a larger company. These are the things that go on. I mean, we see it all the time. Other things. Basically, Games Workshop took a different approach. This approach led to Rick Priestley leaving in 2010 because he felt the company had gotten too corporate, which is why I believe that this started in 1994, because the brand was definitely being pushed towards a wider market, but that wider market was very firmly lodged into a niche that Kirby perceived. And it's one he is even on record of saying it was filled with middle-class male teens and adults. That isn't to say there weren't people that were outside of that who weren't middle-class or weren't male, or weren't kids. But the idea was built on the assumptions that were made by a company that doesn't do market research or didn't do it at the time, which means that in the long run, it was hard to keep people buying stuff. See, Games Workshop's always had a problem. You kind of built an army and then you stopped. Sometimes you might build 2 armies or 3 armies, but most kind of built up the collection they wanted and then they stopped having a reason to buy new stuff. Part of which was because sometimes armies wouldn't get updated for editions at a time. So I might build up my army, say, over the course of an edition, and then not see an update for 2 editions. Well, that's 2 editions. I might not be buying anything new. I might just be shuffling models around to kind of fill the gaps and rearrange things to kind of cover how I want to do stuff without having to actually buy anything new. Of course, this is also, some people are still doing the Stillman method of you built a list and you stuck with it. The only time you adjusted it really was if the points adjusted underneath you and you had to adjust it. Basically, you just stopped buying after. And part of that was just because the game was produced at a much slower rate. The dev team was a lot smaller and had to juggle everything, basically. There was one dev team for Games Workshop, and they handled Warhammer Fantasy, Warhammer 40K, Battlefleet Goth, Necromunda, Mordheim, Inquisitor, Epic, Dreadfleet, Warmaster, Blood Bowl, and I'm probably forgetting games on top of that. They had a lot of stuff on their plate, and they weren't releasing stuff for all of this at the same time. Some things basically never got updated. But the time it took to get those games out was still time that was taken away from working on anything else. This also usually meant that games could have longer lifespans than the 3-year editions, which was great if you're on the community side of things. But for the company, it was not great for sales. And Games Workshop never really completely solved this problem, though there were attempts. And part of that was by pushing points costs down so they can have you buy more models. Now, eventually, we did also increase the points limit played with. During 5th edition, the most common game size was actually 1,500 points, and part of that was because they were tournaments run by Games Workshop, and which affected everything else that were 1,500 points. Well, over time, 1,500 points meant more stuff, and then eventually Hard Boys went away, and we saw points limits go up as people wanted more and more stuff on the table, because they wanted to take all the options. There was no sacrificing certain things. It felt more balanced to have all the toys, because then you weren't caught out with your take-all-comers list, forced to leave anything off the table. Great for, model sales, but that also priced people out of the game, because the larger the game got, the more expensive it was to start an army. But the monetization of the niche didn't stop there. We also saw other changes. Warhammer Fantasy 8th edition introduced a horde mechanic that tried to encourage blocks of 10 by 10 models for specific benefits, which was great if you already had large collections, but if you were new trying to get into the game, as I was at the time, it was horribly discouraging to try to sit down and figure out how many models you still had to build just to start playing. Granted, there were some community aspects on that too, because there was nobody playing lower points to try to accommodate smaller games. This was a common problem. Basically, once you get used to using all your toys, it's hard to get people to let go of them. And it didn't really, it didn't really stop there. We also saw regular, consistent price increases, much like we've started seeing recently, only instead of going up a couple dollars for a box. That's American, mind you. Australian, I'm sorry, you've probably had to give up your second-born as well. New Zealand, I don't even know how you afford models at this point if you resort to piracy. And, I wouldn't blame you. Don't sink too many ships when you do it. But the thing is, they were doing something differently. They were doing it they wouldn't rotate the entire model line at a time. If I had to estimate, I'd say it'd be between a third and a fourth of the line would increase in price, but it would always increase over where that price would be if it hadn't gone through yearly inflation normally. So, for example, if a Space Marine kit, say it was $30 for a box of 10 models, if inflation would have brought it to $35 since the last time it had a price increase, it would go to at least $36, usually more, probably closer to $40. The idea seemed to be that by leapfrogging inflation, they would get a brief period where they would make more money, followed by a period later where they wouldn't make as much money, because let's be honest here, even if GW is below inflation, their pricing system definitely ensures they're still turning a profit, because when they rebox these things into a discounted Battle Force box, we are still pretty sure they are not losing money on anything. They just make less money at a time. But this was a thing that was done, and it was very regular to the point where we would find out at the end of May for price increases in June, which would then result in a brief period where people would be checking, at least if you were in the online community, part of Warhammer, you'd be checking online to find out what was going up in price to get it before it went up if you thought you would need it or want it in the future. But those price increases also priced people out of the hobby. This is a thing that still happens, and it's one of the things that cause a lot of people to be really frustrated with GW, because it's hard to understand why things are priced a certain way when they don't really tell us what's going on. Now, granted, under Roundtree, the current CEO, the price increases are much smaller, which is good. They have also been more frequent, where we had 2 in the last year because they had a post-COVID price increase. Understandable, things did get more expensive, followed by a post-Brexit price increase because suddenly energy costs got higher. But the company wasn't losing money, they were just making less money. And as a publicly traded company, there is they have to make numbers go up to keep the shareholders happy. And now I can't speak for in England, but in America, if you do anything that intentionally devalues the company for the shareholders, you could actually be sued. Like, it is a criminal charge kind of problem. Now, back to the whole model sale thing. GW did try to do more stuff to try to get people to buy more models. In fact, we saw Space Marines rebooted as a model range more than once, partly to get people who already own models to buy new models. The RTB-01 to the 3rd edition Space Marine, for example. Don't get me wrong, nice models. Lasted us all the way up until, I want to say, 6th edition. Those 3rd edition models. Good solid kit. Molds lasted a long time. But the company went out and spent money on new tooling for the molds. More detailed tooling. And they had already been digitally sculpting for years at this point. But basically, what was going on is they were trying to get people to buy Space Marines. Again, so they had scaled them up a little bit. They had also adjusted their poses. There wasn't a huge change in the heroic scaling, so the heads were still the larger size, as were the hands. But generally speaking, the range was refreshed between 6th and 7th. Now, 6th edition, Kirby was still working for the company. He was still CEO, I should say. In 2014, we got this lovely statement from Kirby, as you can see on screen. This is why we know what Kirby thought he was selling to. In 2014, after a global recession and continuing price increases the entire time, and Warhammer Fantasy on its deathbed due to mismanagement such as the continual push for larger and larger armies to monetize a niche as hard as possible, we found out that Games Workshop did not do market research. Games Workshop had no idea what its customer base wanted. Games Workshop was only concerned about its niche. And by Games Workshop, of course, I mean Games Workshop under Tom Kirby, because he would set the tone that his management team would follow and push down to the development staff. This is why, if you've ever heard the story, that when the Wraith Knight rules were being worked on during its time, I want to say it came out in 6th or 7th, but when it was being worked on, it was initially points costed low with the intent of bringing it up. And the designer who points costed it was told, no, leave it at that cost. We'll sell more models. Because that's what, to the management team, that's all that mattered, was model sales. It wasn't about keeping the customers happy. It wasn't trying to about preserving that niche as long as possible. It was about increasing sales in that niche. Basically, it was a very self-destructive sort of approach in the long run. Kirby had done a lot of things that had done good for the company. I mean, he got them through the Lord of the Rings, the rise and fall of that bubble. But when it came to the long-term, what the customer wanted, he just wasn't very good at it. He had basically created an ivory tower for Games Workshop to sit on top of, and he didn't want to find out what customer. Now, how does that tie into the rebooted model line? Well, half of it came out when he was still in charge of Games Workshop. The other half came out after. But you know what else came out after? Primaris Marines. You see, this is where it all kind of gets conspiratorial, and you might have to put a tinfoil hat on. But I believe that the Space Marine reboot was approved under Kirby. It was then split up because there is a release budget. There was only so much they were willing to put out at one time for an army. Now, the way they currently do it usually means that you get at least a character model in every release. Something to keep you going, for the edition, where, that one model may offer you additional playstyle options that'll get you to buy stuff that already exists. Not a bad little strategy, honestly. I wish we had some of the larger releases we used to get, especially when it comes to model refreshes, but as a get-you-buy sort of release deal, a character who offers me a new playstyle, like, say, the Jump Pack Canoness, who was announced earlier the day I recorded this, for the Sisters of Battle, is a great option. The idea of giving you a character who offers a new avenue of play by bringing new synergies is a perfectly good way of adding to the army without overloading it. It encourages model sales, but it doesn't do it in a way that it forces people to actually be forced into position. Now, this isn't exactly what's going on in Primaris. You see, basically, 2014, Kirby that, makes his statement. But we also find out that he's being replaced in the future by Roundtree. Roundtree takes over in 2015. The other half of the project that Kirby approves is re-released. That got us the Devastators. I believe it got us the Stern Guard and the Vanguard veterans. I could be wrong. It could be the way it split those up further. Basically, we had a whole core of the firstborn Marine Army redone and added with grav guns. Grav guns were a new addition specifically added to the Space Marine line to try to get you to buy the new kits. They were pretty aggressively, given pretty aggressive rules that were honestly something I'd kind of like to see come back around, because grav weapons was a cool idea. The idea that you can crush somebody to the weight of their own stuff, and at the time I believe it wounded on the same value as the target's armor save. So the better your armor save, the easier it was to hurt you. And it was really good against vehicles because of that too, because it did something against as well. Great idea. Problem is that if I've got a Marine army, I probably have some extra Marine bodies floating around. Chances are I can either kit bash something that looks like a grav gun, rearrange my army, and just play some count as, say, plasma cannons or grav guns now, because I'm not going to run plasma cannons most of the time. They're not that good. But grav cannons are. So maybe I'll run grav cannons. That kind of thing really doesn't do Games Workshop a favor. Marines have this problem the worst. The interchangeability of kit being so uniform across the board was great for creating a cohesive model range where it felt like a Marine could pick up and do anything in the chapter. The problem is when you can just go, hey, my Devastator Marines I'm going to swap them over into my tactical squads and spread out my heavy weapons a little bit, because I have maybe missile launchers are better in tactical squads this edition, instead of having a missile launcher Devastator team. And these extra guys I'll go ahead and use these bits I've got to make las cannon Devastators and have a group of those. That doesn't help Games Workshop make sales. Basically, the problem was, if you had an existing army, it was hard to sell to you, but it was worse for Marine players, because they have had the most ability to kit bash their way out of anything, or just move models around and kind of fill in. This doesn't apply to Primary Marines, because they did something frustrating as a person who enjoys kit bashing, but clever from the business side of things. See, they did a couple of things. The first off is, if you look at the units, it's one weapon type per unit. There's no mixing them. That means that if I've got Hellblasters, I cannot reuse them and mix them into my other squads to solve whatever the current meta is. So there aren't going to be plasma guns in my intercessor squads. Additionally, they also brought out new armor types. Gravis, for example, it's different from Terminator armor. It fills a very similar role. Power fist, decent shooting, chunky, but it was also different. You got 3 to a unit instead of 5. The style is different, so you couldn't really just one for one trade one for the other. These sorts of things are intentional. Not only does it discourage people from being able to just kit bash their way into having a new unit out of stuff they've got left over, assuming you actually have anything left over, because there's not a lot of extra bits to work with out of these things, other than maybe heads, shoulder pads, some arms. But kits are less compatible in general. Gravis armor bits do not look the same as bits from the tactical set. Parts of the Phobos sets do not look very similar to tacticals. I think the arms are about the only thing that you can really kind of cross over between those, which could lead to some cool kit bashing. But it does lead to some situations where if you want specific looks, you have to work harder to get those looks, and they do less for you in the long run. Basically, what they've done is they found a way to make sure that anytime GW releases a new kit for Space Marines, if you want the benefits of that kit, you have to buy the kit. And as frustrating as it is as somebody who likes to mix and match bits to make custom models, especially characters, I can understand what they're doing. Doesn't fill me with any sorts of excitement, but I do understand at least. And that has given them the ability to make sure that the existing customer base has reasons to continue to buy stuff. Those solo characters, they open up new playstyles, are a reason for you to buy new things, other than just a copy of your codex. Those kits that are specific to weapon types, armor types, and kind of mix things around like that, give you a reason to buy stuff. Why else did we get Gravis Marines that were basically just tactical Marines with heavier guns? Because it was an excuse to buy new stuff. Now we can justify it and go, well, those Gravis guys fit better with these kinds of chapters that feel play. But really, we're just kind of coming up with an excuse on why we want the new toys. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. A large part about this is about customizing your army to fit a playstyle that you have in mind. But this customization doesn't come from how you equip a squad. It's what squads you put in your army instead. So, this doesn't mean that you can't use Firstborn mods, even as they will go out the door. If we lose the tactical squad tomorrow, you could still take all your Firstborn Marines with bolters and run them as intercessors as long as they're roughly the same height as the regular Marines. You could take all your missile launcher guys and run them as Desolation Marines. In fact, some people are probably doing that just because they think they look better. Nothing wrong with that. But that lack of overlap is going to be a continuing thing we're going to keep seeing because it helps monetize the existing base. But, and this is to go back to what we were seeing with the Warhammers for Everyone statement. When you get past the part that everybody gets stuck on, and you go a little bit further down, you'll see that they promised that we are going to continue to see more diversity in the setting, so there are more characters and ideas for people to connect with. We've seen that with a wider range of paints designed specifically for a wider range of skin tones. We have seen that with characters on the books themselves being more than just pasty white dudes or charcoal black salamanders. That isn't to say we didn't get them before. Celestial Lions are traditionally a chapter that is supposed to be very much like the African Savannah, which means a traditional African skin tone range, but one of the only stories that they actually feature in, we don't even see the dude's face. Good story, though. Great story. I actually recommend reading it before you read Spear of the Emperor. And yes, they are connected. I'm not going to spoil everything, but I do recommend reading both. They are both good, because they're a great way to see how freaking petty the Inquisition is. Yes, I'm going on a tangent to recommend 2 stories to you. Thing is, that diversity seems to matter. And the reason I say this is, look at Age of Sigmar. Now, I want you to look at how they advertise Age of Sigmar, especially in the last edition. We have a literal cardboard stand that is a female Stormcast, who is almost as tall as a Primaris Marine. But not only is, she almost as tall as a Primaris Marine, but she is the poster, effectively, for the army, for the whole game, really. It is a woman front and center wearing plate armor, practical plate armor. It's still fantasy styled, but it isn't, we're not looking at a Red Sonja, chainmail bikini here. So it's a different aesthetic that we usually see applied to fantasy settings in a lot of cases, which is going to be attractive to women. Because even if they don't want to play Stormcast, even if they don't want to play female Stormcast models, let's be honest here, seeing positive representation where you see a woman who's dressed in armor that looks like it makes sense for the job that she's doing is going to be something that's going to be, at least to me, seems pretty like a cool idea. But that isn't all what they did. The big named character for the 3rd edition box set was Yandrasta, who is apparently Sigmar's favorite hunter. Well, so we got a female named character who was super important to the setting, or to the faction, I should say, at least. She later got a book too that I still need to go around reading. But that, that's a big positive thing. And then you go and look at the Age of Sigmar 4th edition trailer. Who was the main human focus of that trailer? It is a woman who is a Stormcast, and we see her at different reforging in her life and career as she progresses in rank and power and responsibility, and also has to continue dealing with escalating threats. Every time she gets stronger, she has to fight stronger things. And honestly, I think that's pretty cool. It's a great, concise, short story. And honestly, I think that Games Workshop looked at how there are more women playing Age of Sigmar and said, well, we've been advertising women on the game. Maybe we should do the same thing in 40K. Well, what's post-human gold? Well, I mentioned the Celestial Lions earlier, but that's not quite what I mean. I think the reason Custodes got women in it was because they are the closest analog to Stormcast we're going to get in 40k. Large, they wear gold armor, they are the peak of what humanity has to offer, short of, literal gods, or in the case of 40k, Primarchs. So, basically, what it looks like they're doing, at least from the outside, is they've looked at how well the community has grown and become more diverse in one game, and is looking to match that in their larger flagship game because they want a wider customer base. Because the thing is, the wider your customer base is, the harder it is to be rocked by anything that's going on. When the customer base is a tight niche, like it was for most when Kirby was in charge of the company, it made it easier for Warhammer Fantasy to die, because that smaller niche was more easily driven away or affected in a negative manner than a wider customer base would be. With a wider customer base, it also means that they're going to see more persistent sales. It also makes growth easier, because with more customers, you have more people trying to bring more other people in. Basically, it's easier to get people to play the game the more people that are already playing it. And if you can show people that the game is popular, they might look for reasons to play it and find a faction that they enjoy because they want to play with their friends. And I could be wrong. Maybe it was just a whim. Maybe it was something that was planned for a while. Maybe it was something that was planned since Aaron Dembski Bowden wrote Master of Mankind and was told by a manager of the studio at the time that he couldn't put female Custodes in there because they didn't sculpt any female heads. Which is just, unfortunately, short-sighted, because the fact was, we had nothing that said that women couldn't be Custodes at the time. But there was an in-studio decision where somebody basically didn't think about sculpting women for the heads because they were marketing to a niche. And that niche was male. And they assumed that none of them wanted to play women because in the 80s, and I am going back to that far because this is kind of where this starts as far as we can tell, in the early 80s, there was a model range called the C01 Fighters. So it was an RPG range, and it was basically you got a random selection of, I want to say, 3 models to a blister. Some of them were women. And from what we have learned from Alan Merritt, running the IP side of things and handling stuff like the stores and determining release orders and various other things involving, the IP management, basically they kept getting complaints from stores that blisters that had women in them did not sell or sold worse than the other blisters, which meant later, when they got around to Warhammer 40k, in the late 80s, the initial idea of running 25% of all factions as women, which was the initial plan, changed. And they largely dropped women in the initial early part of the game. We didn't have a lot, at least in the miniatures, many, if any, women actually on the table in the initial first 2 editions of the game until we got Sisters of Battle in 1987. That isn't to say we didn't have women at all, but they were far less common. And in Space Marines, they were dropped altogether to include providing a retconned reason for it through the gene seed, which was retconned from gene sperm. Gotta love how early Warhammer was a tumultuous train wreck of ideas. It's still entertaining to go back and look at. What's really fun, if you have the time, is going back and looking at Road Trader and then looking at what we have now and seeing where some of these things pop up again. Like in Rogue Trader, we had Enslavers. Necromunda just announced their new season, which included the Mal-strain Gene Stealers, who are accompanied by something that look a lot like Enslavers. We don't know at the time I'm recording this if they are Enslavers, but it is a very interesting kind of situation that we're looking at. Basically, GW doesn't leave ideas on the table. They go into a pile to be recycled. They reinvent, they re-examine things, because the people who decided that idea wasn't going to work now isn't always the person who's writing that idea later. And those ideas may appeal to the wider customer base they're trying to build currently than they were able to build in 1987 or 1994 or 1997 or 2004. Because the game kept evolving, and it's going to keep evolving. And I'm going to be honest, I don't always like everything it does. I have complaints about 10th edition. I have been trying to find the best way to voice them for a couple months now because I've had complicated feelings about the direction the game is going in, and trying to explain them has not been the easiest thing for me because they're complicated, and it's specifically about the game, and it's not about the idea that they might add women to a faction, nor is it about the fact that they put a black man on the cover of a Space Marine novel. Basically, when you get down to it, a lot of this stuff is going to... We're going to see Games Workshop to try push the boundaries out for who is in the setting, because that brings more people's eyes onto the product. And when these guys are freaking out on the internet about Games Workshop doing it again, all they're doing is bringing more eyeballs to things. Why do I know this is true? Because I only learned about Trench Crusade because of their massive tantrum on Twitter, because they got kicked out of a Discord after acting like a bunch of ass clowns. Basically, the thing is that we're looking at a continuing situation where people acting poorly in response to changes or information they don't agree with only gets more eyeballs onto that product, and in the long term brings more people into playing that product. Because I hate to tell them, actually I lied, I don't hate to tell them, because I don't think they listened this far into the video. They probably gave up the second I started talking. But honestly, when we see things happen and they claim they're going to boycott, and then the company isn't affected in any way, shape, or form, and continues doing what they've been doing since before they, threaten their boycott, they are clearly not a significant part of the target audience anymore. They're not even probably a significant part of the customer base anymore. Or if they are so poor at actually backing up their threats of boycott that they are safe to ignore. And honestly, either way, they're not going to make Games Workshop stop doing what they're doing because it's working. How do I know it's working? Because if you look at 2020 and on, they have been doing nothing but making more and more freaking money. That is too much freaking money, by the way. But they are making that much money, and at least they are paying out decent bonuses to their employees at the end of the year. So where does that really leave us? Well, it leaves us with two things. One, Games Workshop's going to continue to evolve the games. They have an interest of growing the audiences to make more money. This is going to mean they are going to try to make things more diverse, because they want a diverse player base, because a diverse player base is a very stable player base. A very niche market is more susceptible to massive fluctuations over the smallest things, and they do not enjoy having the market just kind of flip on them like that. They don't want a repeat of Warhammer Fantasy where they have to take a game out behind the woodshed and put it down like Old Yeller. And the community doesn't want that either. The thing is that we are only going to see a stable community when we have a diverse one, when we have a very niche one that is very fixated on very specific ideas, such as LARPing as Space Marines on the internet, and misunderstanding that the satire of the setting is satire. Well, that niche is very susceptible to just kind of losing its shit over the smallest things. And Games Workshop doesn't want that. It's not a healthy community for those of us who are in the community either. And at the end of the day, they're not going to be the ones that they're going to get marketed. It's the rest of us that are. And they can claim that, but, it's like it's going mainstream. It's ruined forever. I'm sorry, but Games Workshop has always tried to be mainstream. It's always wanted to be the miniature company. They call themselves Games Workshop for a reason. I mean, they call themselves Warhammer now because they want to use that brand identity more strongly, because Warhammer is the thing that everybody associates them with. But basically, they have always tended to be a company that you think of first when you think of miniatures. There's a reason they call themselves the best miniature company in the world. Now, granted, that is just how they see themselves. And I'm sure that you can argue that one company or another is better at miniatures for one reason or the other. I will not debate that. I am not their PR person. I am a dude who lives in Northwest Montana who tries to figure out why Games Workshop does things because I'm bored doing my retail job, not somebody who has to try to figure out how to make them more money. And yeah, sometimes, they do things and I don't like it. but those things are usually tied to the actual business practices with price increases, how they handle certain aspects of their IP or rules. And I will be talking about rules in the future because, surprise, the next video I am working on is about 10th edition so far. It's been around a year now, since 10th edition was announced, and I intend to have the next video out before the 10th edition's launch anniversary rolls around, because it'll get buried under Age of Sigmar content for a little while by other people, I'm sure. But basically, I want to look back at 10th edition. I want to try to unpack the thoughts I've had about it to better talk about what issues I have with it and where I hope they can do better, and if they can't, where I may be trying to spend my energy, because I still really care about narrative content. But I have some strong feelings about how 10th editions handle narrative, and I want to dig into those, but this is obviously not the video for it. Now, before I wrap up, there's a couple of things I want to kind of touch on. First, Warhammer is a hobby. It's a hobby like any other hobby. It's something you do to try to find a way to relax and have joy in between the mess of everything else that is going on in your life. Now, for some people, that means pure escapism from reality. Okay, fine. You want escapism. I can understand that. Personally, when I want escapism, I want it away from the real life drama and done in such a way that I can kind of point and laugh at the problems of the world, rather than feel like I'm just repeating them. But, we all have our own ways of escaping from stress. We also have different hobbies we enjoy. Some people only enjoy the books. Some people only enjoy the video games. Some people like a blend of things. There are painters, there are modelers, there are people who only play the game and won't paint their models, and even with contrast paint, in their hands. I don't understand it as somebody who enjoys painting as something therapeutic and kind of meditative that I can do to kind of relax my overactive brain. But I get that we all don't enjoy things the same, which is why I try not to point at people not doing specific aspects of hobby and say they're not part of the community. Because the thing is, the community is a very broad thing where we all interact with it, the IP that is Warhammer differently. The only time I tend to get up in arms is when I don't see them interact in any way that actually contributes to the community, and it's only fixated on the idea of keeping others out of it. To me, that's when you're not really part of the community, you're a problem, because a brand does not need a bouncer. You are not the valiant knight riding out against the marauding hordes. You're an asshole on the internet who is telling people that they can't do certain things because you don't want them to. I'm sorry, but if somebody wants to put female heads on their Space Marines, or if they want to paint their Necrons pink, or if they want to carefully glue felt, fuzzy felt material or whatever else onto their models, that is up to them. It isn't up to you how somebody chooses to express themselves when participating in the hobby. And honestly, if you're so fixated on what other people do that it makes you upset that they did it, then I'm not sure that you're actually in this hobby for the hobby, but rather because you want to keep others from being in the hobby, which doesn't seem like the best place. You should be in the hobby for your personal win, not because you're trying to claim ownership on it and keep it from everyone else. Hobbies are best shared. Now, granted, that's just how I see it. That's how I enjoy it. I enjoy sharing my hobby. So when I paint models, or I do color testing, or if I'm just randomly thinking of something involving the setting, I share it because I find enjoyment in it. Even the random nonsense I think up sometimes, where it's like a kind of what if, kind of thing that I tweet out because I think it might be funny. Or I make up stuff like the idea that the Imperium doesn't have the STC for chicken nuggies. Granted, that could be true. There's nothing that says that's not. But there's nothing that says it is. It's just something that's kind of funny to me. And the idea is something I enjoyed enough that I wanted to share it with others. Basically, do your hobby because it makes you happy, not do your hobby because it makes somebody else miserable. If you're painting and I quote windmill colors on your models, you aren't really doing it because it makes you happy, unless you're really happy with painting Nazis for some reason. And if you are, you know that you can play bolt action, right? They literally have Nazis. You can play the SS and paint all the swastikas you want if that's the route you go down. It's even made by people who helped make Warhammer in the past. So, solid rule set. The thing is, when you do a hobby for your enjoyment and you share that enjoyment with others, they will also find enjoyment and then will share their enjoyment back. It is a reinforcing loop that makes it more enjoyable. When you do it because you only want to make other people miserable, you do not get that joy back. You do not get that positive reinforcement. You do not get that good feeling of sharing something good. And I really can't figure out why you're doing a hobby at that point, honestly. I mean, granted, you don't always have to do all hobbies with other people. I play video games from time to time, usually whenever my hyperfixations kind of shift in that direction. I briefly went through a period of playing a lot of Fallout 4. It's not a game that I'm going to claim is great, but I was enjoying what I was playing, and then I kind of peter out for a while, and I won't pick up, controller for my PS4 for months at a time sometimes. It's all about finding a balance, though. I play it when it brings me joy. I stop playing it when it doesn't. And sometimes you do have to take a break from your hobby. If I get burnt out on painting, or if I overfixate on reading and it burns me out, I read for a while, that's okay. I take a break from the things that are bothering me and I come back to it. But if I ever got to the point where I was no longer finding any joy whatsoever in Warhammer, I'd honestly advise you and my future self, if this ever happens, to find something else. Maybe I burn out of Warhammer entirely and I move on to another game. Maybe miniature wargaming stops being a thing I enjoy. In that case, I should be looking for something else that brings me joy outside of, so that I have more in my life than a retail job and shouting at people on Twitter whenever they act like an asshole. So, of course, that is just how I see it. And before I wrap this all up, I want to give a special thanks to the folks on Patreon who kick me a few extra bucks every month. That little bit of extra money does help me work on these things more, because it means I'm not trying to pull overtime at work just to buy another box of miniatures once in a while. Instead, I can be trying to focus on things like this. And they actually got a completely different version of this video before this version of the video was recorded. Yeah, I really did record this twice, and they get both versions. Hopefully I can actually get the next video out going through multiple editions. Granted, it's going to be less focused on what the company is doing as a company, so I shouldn't have to make any adjustments unless it takes me so long that the balanced data slate comes out before I finish. But in the meantime, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day and find that joy in your hobby and share it with others. Joy is best shared, because then that joy gets reflected back to you. And that sort of positive thing is a great thing to participate in. And maybe you don't believe me. Okay, that's fine too. But either way, I hope you have a happy hobby, because if you're not being happy, it just sounds miserable. And I don't know what to tell you there. Since I don't really know how to finish this off, I guess I'm just going to kind of, heat her out right about now and say bye.